At 18, I found out my parents used my college savings to fund my sister's destination wedding. You're not exactly Harvard material. Mom laughed. I built my own future anyway. Now they want help with her divorce bills. I, 28M, own and operate a mid-sized freight logistics company right here in the Midwest. I live a pretty standard, quiet life. I have a house, a rescue dog, and a bank account that finally lets me sleep soundly at night without waking up in a cold sweat. But exactly 10 years ago, I was just an 18-year-old high school senior staring at a glowing ATM screen in the lobby of a local credit union, trying to understand why the numbers simply were not making sense. I had been working since I was 14. I mowed lawns in the brutal summer heat, shoveled driveways in the freezing winter, bus tables at a rundown diner on the highway until midnight, and eventually picked up grueling weekend warehouse shifts unloading heavy freight trucks. Every single spare dollar I made went directly into a savings account my father had opened for me years prior. It was a custodial account, a UTMA, meant specifically for my college tuition. My late grandfather had seeded it with $5,000 when I was born, and through my own literal sweat, calluses, and completely missed teenage years, I had built that balance up to just over $32,000. That money was my absolute ticket out. It was my tuition, my housing, my entire future mapped out in a neat little ledger. The screen blinked back at me with a harsh green light. Available balance, $14.50. I tapped the screen again, my hands physically shaking. I thought the machine was broken. I pulled my card out, wiped the chip on my jeans, and put it back in. Same number, $14.50. I walked up to the teller window. The woman working there knew me well, because I came in every single Friday afternoon to deposit my crumpled diner tips. I asked her to check my balance, praying there was just a system error. She pulled up my profile, frowned deeply, and turned her monitor slightly so I couldn't fully see it. She looked at me with this profound, devastating pity. She lowered her voice to a whisper and said, "Your father came in on Tuesday. He initiated a massive wire transfer. He is the legal custodian on the account until you turn 18 next week. He drained the entire balance." I drove home in total, suffocating silence. The world felt completely hollowed out, like someone had scooped out my insides with melon baller. When I walked to the front door of my parents' house, the smell of ridiculously expensive catering food hit me right in the face. My mother, my father, and my older sister, who was 23 at the time, were gathered around a large oak dining room table. The entire surface was completely covered in glossy brochures, expensive fabric swatches, and iPad screens displaying luxury villas in Tuscany. My sister was getting married. She had been engaged for barely 3 months, and the wedding planning had instantly consumed the entire household like a plague. I walked into the dining room and just stood in the doorway. I looked directly at my father. I asked him where my money was. The room went completely still. My sister didn't even bother to look up from a glossy brochure about imported floral arrangements. My father shifted uncomfortably in his chair, suddenly finding the grain of the wood table very interesting. My mother, however, just took a slow, deliberate sip of her coffee and looked at me with an expression of mild, almost bored annoyance. She told me to keep my voice down. She explained, as if she were talking to a toddler, that they needed to secure the venue in Italy and the deposit was substantial. I told them that was my college money. My voice was trembling, so hard I could barely form the words. I told them I worked for that money, that Grandpa left that for me. My father finally mumbled, looking at his hands, that it was family money. He said my sister was getting married once, that it was a major life event, and that I could just take out student loans like everyone else. He promised they would help me pay them back later, a promise I knew instantly was entirely empty. I stepped closer to the table and told them they had just stolen $32,000 from me. I told them I needed that money for the fall semester, that I had already been accepted to the state university, and that I needed to pay the housing deposit by the end of the month. My sister finally looked up, clearly annoyed that the spotlight had shifted away from her imported ranunculus arrangements. She rolled her eyes and told me to calm down. She said it was not a big deal, that I could just go to community college. She actually looked me up and down and said it was not like I was going anywhere prestigious anyway. I looked at my mother, desperately waiting for her to intervene, waiting for her to defend me, to realize the absolute gravity of what they had just done to her own son. Instead, she just let out a short, dismissive breath. She told me my sister was right. She waved her hand in the air and told me to be realistic. She looked me dead in the eyes and said I was not exactly Harvard material. She said I had always been more of a manual labor type, and that spending $30,000 on a degree for me was a bad investment. She said my sister needed this wedding because it was about our family's image and social standing. I didn't scream. I didn't flip the heavy oak table. The absolute, freezing clarity of that moment just paralyzed me. I realized right then, looking at the three of them, that I was not a son or a brother to them. I was a resource. I was an accessory to my sister's life, a stepping stone, and my future was entirely expendable if it bought them a slightly better view of the Italian countryside for a weekend. I turned around and walked up to my room. I grabbed a duffel bag and a heavy-duty trash bag. I packed my clothes, my laptop, my grandfather's old watch, and my important documents like my birth certificate and social security card. I walked back down the stairs 10 minutes later. They were actually still sitting there, arguing loudly about the specific shade of the bridesmaid dresses. They didn't even notice me walking out the front door. I slept in my car for 3 days. I showered at a local 24-hour gym. I swallowed every ounce of pride I had and begged the manager at the warehouse where I had been working part-time for full-time hours. He saw the desperation in my eyes and gave me the shifts. I rented a tiny, miserable room in a terrible part of town that smelled constantly of stale smoke and bleach. I did not go to the state university that fall. I simply could not afford it. I spent the next 4 years working brutal night shifts loading freight, taking community college classes during the day, and eventually transferring to a local commuter college to get a degree in supply chain management. Legally, I looked into getting my money back. I went to a free legal clinic. The lawyer there was sympathetic, but honest, because my father had drained the UTMA account just days before my 18th birthday. He was still technically the custodian. To prove he breached his fiduciary duty by spending it on a wedding instead of my benefit, I would have to sue him in civil court. As an 18-year-old with exactly $14 to his name, hiring a lawyer to wage a multi-year civil litigation battle against my parents was entirely impossible. The justice system requires massive capital to fight for stolen capital. So I swallowed the loss. I channeled every single ounce of betrayal and anger into my work. By the time I was 24, I had saved enough cash to buy a single, heavily used freight truck and lease it out to owner-operators. By 26, I had 5 trucks. Now, at 28, I have a massive fleet, a massive commercial warehouse, and a local reputation for being entirely ruthless but incredibly fair in business. I never spoke to my family again. Not once. I changed my phone number the week I moved out. I blocked them on every single social media platform. I heard through grapevine of old hometown acquaintances that the Tuscan wedding was a lavish, 6-figure affair that looked absolutely beautiful on Instagram. I didn't care. I had built my own empire out of the dirt they had happily buried me in. Then, exactly 3 weeks ago, my receptionist buzzed my office line. She sounded incredibly confused. She told me there were 2 people in the lobby claiming to be my parents, and they were demanding to see me immediately, saying it was a massive family emergency. I just stared at the blinking red light on my desk phone. 10 years. 10 years of absolute, unbroken silence. I told my receptionist to send them back to my office. Honestly, I wanted to see this. I wanted to see what kind of nerve they had. My mother and father walked into my office. They looked older, certainly, but that same rigid posture of complete entitlement had not changed one bit. They didn't bother to look around at my nice office. They didn't ask how I was doing. They didn't acknowledge the decade of estrangement. They just walked right in and sat down heavily in the leather chairs across from my desk. My mother leaned forward and announced that my sister was getting a divorce, entirely skipping any form of greeting. I leaned back in my chair, steepling my fingers, and just looked at her. I asked her what that had to do with me. My father chimed in, looking highly agitated. He said her husband was being an absolute monster. He claimed the guy was trying to leave her with absolutely nothing, that he had cut off all her credit cards, and that she had been forced to move back into my parents' guest room. He said she needed a lawyer, a very aggressive one, to make sure she got her fair share of his retirement assets, but the retainer was astronomical. I kept my voice perfectly level. I asked them again why they were sitting in my office telling me this. My mother sighed loudly, doing that exact same familiar, dismissive wave of her hand from 10 years ago, acting as if I were being intentionally thick. She explained that they were retired now. Their fixed income was tied up in investments, and they had seen online that I owned this massive company. She said I was clearly doing very well, and that family helps family. She told me, didn't ask, but told me that they needed me to write a check right then and there for $40,000 to cover her legal fees and clear some of her immediate personal debts. She actually had the nerve to tell me to consider it an investment in my sister's future. I just stared at them. The sheer, unadulterated audacity was almost hypnotic to watch. They had not spoken to me in a decade. They had literally stolen my future to buy her a giant party. And now that the party was officially over, they wanted me to finance the legal cleanup. I spoke very slowly. I asked them to clarify. I asked if they wanted me to pay $40,000 to fund the divorce from the exact same marriage that they had stolen my college fund to pay for. My mother snapped at me. She leaned forward, her face turning red, and told me that was 10 years ago and I needed to let it go. She pointed around my office and said I clearly did fine. She actually said they clearly made the right choice back then, because it built my character. She said my sister was in crisis, completely destitute, and that I owed it to this family to step up and do my part. I dropped my hands to the desk. I told them I didn't owe them oxygen. I told them they were not my family, but rather two strangers who committed financial fraud against a minor. I told them to get out of my office before I had my warehouse security drag them out to the parking lot. My father stood up, furious. He called me an ungrateful brat. He yelled that they had housed me and fed me for 18 years, that I owed them a massive debt, and that they would not leave my office until I agreed to help my sister. I didn't argue with him. I simply pressed the intercom button on my phone and told my receptionist to call the local police and report 2 hostile trespassers refusing to leave a private business premises. They panicked and scrambled out of the office before the police could even be dispatched, shouting absolute obscenities at me down the main hallway. I genuinely thought that would be the end of it. I thought setting a completely hard boundary would send them scurrying away back to their suburb. I vastly underestimated their desperation, and I vastly underestimated the depths of their entitlement. Over the next week, the harassment completely escalated. My sister somehow got my company's public customer service line and started leaving daily voicemails. She would cry hysterically, putting on this massive performance about how I was abandoning her to a financially abusive monster, begging me to save her life. My parents went nuclear on social media. They started posting these massive, dramatic paragraphs on Facebook, tagging my business page, writing about how corporate greed had corrupted my soul and how I was coldly turning my back on a domestic abuse victim. I had my corporate lawyers draft and send a formal cease and desist letter to their house, but they completely ignored it. Then the real dirty trick happened, the one that sealed their fate. I was sitting at my desk reviewing a complex logistics contract when my personal cell phone buzzed with a high-priority alert from my Experian credit monitoring app. A new line of credit had just been opened in my name. I immediately dropped my pen and logged into the app. Right there on the screen, a brand new high-yield premium credit card had been approved and opened 2 days ago. The current balance was exactly $15,000. I felt a cold, sharp spike of adrenaline hit my chest. I called the credit card company's fraud department immediately. I explained that I had absolutely not opened this account. The representative put me on a brief hold, verified my identity through a series of security questions, and then read back the details of the fraudulent application. The card had been applied for using my exact social security number, my full legal name, and my date of birth. But the mailing address on the application was my parents' house address. The email address associated with the account was a slight variation of my mother's personal email. I realized immediately how she did it. When you get approved for this specific premium card, they give you a virtual card number instantly on the screen, to use before the physical car arrives in the mail. I asked the representative what the $15,000 charge was for. My voice was deadly quiet. The representative told me it was a single transaction, processed the day before, paid to a merchant listed as Sterling and Hayes Family Law. It was a massive divorce lawyer's retainer fee. My mother, realizing I was never going to hand over a dime, had dug up my Social Security number, which she obviously still had written down in her old filing cabinet from when I was a kid, and used it to apply for a credit card pretending to be me. She got the instant virtual number and immediately swiped it for $15,000 to hire my sister's vicious divorce attorney. They genuinely thought they had outsmarted me. They thought I would either just quietly pay the bill to protect my pristine credit score, or that I wouldn't notice the account until it was way too late and the money was gone. I didn't call them. I didn't yell. I just smiled. It was a cold, terrifying smile. They had finally crossed a line from being terrible, selfish parents to committing a literal, documentable federal crime. I instructed the fraud department to immediately lock the account, freeze everything, and informed them I would be providing a formal police report to dispute the charges as fraudulent. Then I hung up and made a completely different phone call. I searched for my sister's soon-to-be ex-husband on LinkedIn. I found his profile and sent him a direct message. I wrote, "We need to talk about your wife. I have information that will massively help your divorce case." We met at a quiet coffee shop 3 towns over later that same afternoon. My brother-in-law looked absolutely exhausted. He had deep, dark circles under his eyes and looked like he hadn't slept a full night in months. When I sat down and introduced myself, he looked completely confused. He told me bluntly that my sister had told him I was dead. He said she told him I died in a tragic car crash right after high school. I told him I was very much alive, and that she only said that because she didn't want him asking awkward questions about why her own brother wasn't at the lavish wedding he helped pay for. I asked him to tell me what was actually going on with the divorce. He opened up his heavy leather briefcase right there on the table. He pulled out a thick stack of papers and showed me the financial forensics his own lawyer had dug up. My sister was not a victim of financial abuse. She was the absolute perpetrator of it. For the last 4 years of their marriage, she had been slowly, systematically siphoning money out of their joint savings accounts and funneling it into a secret, hidden account in her own name. She had even forged his signature on documents to take out a massive second mortgage on their family home just to fund luxury girls' trip vacations and buy high-end designer clothes. When he finally found out about the massive hidden debt and confronted her, she panicked, filed for divorce first, and claimed he was financially controlling her to get ahead of the narrative and play the victim. He rubbed his face and told me she had left him nearly $80,000 in hidden debt. He said now she had hired Sterling and Hayes, the most aggressive, ruthless family law sharks in the entire city, to try and legally take half of his remaining retirement accounts. He said he had no idea how she even afforded their massive retainer, because he knew she was completely broke. I reached into my pocket and slid a printed piece of paper across the table. It was a detailed screenshot of the fraudulent credit card charge from my Experian report. I told him she afforded it because my mother committed felony identity theft to pay for it. My brother-in-law just stared at the paper. I could see the pieces clicking together in his head in real time. The family trait wasn't just simple entitlement. It was active, malicious, calculated fraud. I told him I was leaving the coffee shop and going straight to the local police precinct. I told him I was filing a formal criminal report for identity theft and wire fraud against my mother. I explained I would be signing a sworn affidavit stating I did not authorize that payment to Sterling and Hayes, which meant the credit card company would reverse the massive charge as fraudulent. I looked him in the eye and said that by tomorrow morning, her fancy, aggressive lawyers were going to drop her as a client the second they realized they were paid with stolen, fraudulent funds. He looked up at me, a slow, massive grin spreading across his exhausted face. He asked if he could please have a copy of that police report. He said his lawyer would absolutely love to introduce hard evidence of her and her family committing active criminal fraud to fund her legal defense during their upcoming asset distribution hearing. I told him to take 2 copies. I left the coffee shop and drove directly to the main police precinct. I walked in, asked to speak to a detective in the financial crimes unit, and laid absolutely everything out on his desk. I provided my original birth certificate, my driver's license, the detailed credit report showing the fraudulent application, the exact location and time to charge, and my mother's home address and IP information that the credit card company had flagged. Under U.S. law, specifically in our state, what my mother did was aggravated identity theft. Given that the amount was $15,000, it crossed the threshold into a major felony: theft by deception, fraud. The detective took meticulous notes, his expression hardening as he reviewed the stack of documents. He looked at me very seriously and said I needed to understand that if we pursue this, they don't just ask for the money back. He told me the state prosecutes, and my mother will be looking at potential jail time. I looked at him without a single ounce of hesitation and told him to prosecute her. I told him to press every single charge legally available and that I would gladly testify in court. I filed a formal police report. I also went online right there in the precinct lobby and filed an official identity theft report with the FTC. I submitted both official documents directly to the credit card company's fraud department. The trap was completely set. Now, I just had to wait for the legal system to do its job. Unlike the movies, arrests for financial crimes don't happen overnight. The detective had to formally subpoena the IP logs from the credit card company to prove the application came from my parents' internet router. He had to get an affidavit from the law firm confirming who exactly authorized the payment. It took exactly 3 agonizing, silent weeks for the detective to build an absolutely bulletproof case. Then, the hammer finally dropped. I was standing in my warehouse checking shipping manifests when my personal cell phone started completely blowing up. It was missed call after missed call from my father, dozens of them. Then came the frantic, unhinged text messages. He texted, "What did you do? The police are here. They are taking your mother away. Call them off right now. Call them off." I didn't respond. I simply put my phone on silent, put it in my pocket, and went back to checking my freight manifests. I found out later from a neighbor that the police hadn't just knocked on their door. They executed the arrest warrant while my mother was hosting her monthly homeowners association board meeting in their living room. They walked right in past the cheese platter and put her in handcuffs in front of the entire neighborhood gossip committee. Later that evening, as I was pulling my truck into my quiet driveway, I saw my father's sedan parked aggressively on my front lawn, tearing up the grass. He and my sister were standing on my porch. My sister was sobbing hysterically, her expensive makeup running down her face in dark streaks. My father looked absolutely deranged, his clothes messy and his face purple with rage. As soon as I stepped out of my truck, they rushed me. My father screamed at the top of his lungs, asking if I was completely insane. He yelled that they arrested her, that they put her in handcuffs in front of all their friends, and that she was currently sitting in a holding cell. He demanded I call the police and tell them it was a massive misunderstanding and drop the charges right that second. I just leaned against the heavy metal door of my truck, feeling perfectly, beautifully calm. I told him I couldn't drop the charges, even if I wanted to. I explained that isn't how the legal system works. The state prosecutor presses charges for major felonies, not the victim. I told him I just provided the evidence, and she was the one who broke the law. My sister shrieked at me, pointing a shaking, manicured finger. She yelled that she was my mother and that she only did what she had to do to protect her daughter. She screamed that I had millions of dollars and $15,000 was pennies to me, and that I was destroying our entire family over nothing. I pushed off the truck and walked slowly toward them. My voice cut through her hysterics like absolute ice. I told her that she destroyed this family 10 years ago for a party in Italy. I reminded her how they stole my future, how they mocked me, how they told me I wasn't Harvard material and was just meant for manual labor. They both took a nervous step back. I kept walking toward them. I told them they were right. I didn't go to Harvard, but I told them I learned exactly how the real world works. And in the real world, when you steal someone's identity to commit felony wire fraud, you go to prison. I told them I didn't do this to her. She did this to herself. I said they all thought they could just use me as a personal bank whenever they completely wrecked their own lives. They thought I was stupid, but I told them I was the one standing on my own property with a clean conscience, and she was the one sitting in a concrete cell wearing an orange jumpsuit. My father completely lost his mind. He lunged forward and grabbed the collar of my jacket, screaming that he would ruin me and tell everyone in town what I did to my own mother. I grabbed his wrist, twisted it sharply until he let go, and shoved him hard backward. He stumbled clumsily and fell onto the grass. I looked down at him and told him to tell everyone. I told him to tell the whole town she was arrested for felony fraud and explained exactly why. I told him to see how much that helped their precious social standing. Then I looked over at my sister, who was staring at me in pure, unadulterated horror. I smiled at her and said, "By the way, Sterling and Hayes dropped you this afternoon." I told her the credit card company fully reversed the charge, and elite law firms do not represent clients who pay their retainers with stolen credit cards. I also let her know that her husband's lawyer had just formally submitted my police report to the family court judge. I told her that her asset dissipation case was completely, utterly screwed. My sister let out a wail that sounded like a literal dying animal. Her legs gave out, and she dropped to her knees right there on my pavement. I told them both to get off my property immediately. I told them if either of them ever came anywhere near me, my business, or my home ever again, I would have them arrested for trespassing and harassment. I told them we were permanently done. I walked up my front steps, unlocked my heavy door, and went inside. I locked the deadbolt behind me. I didn't even bother to look out the window, as they eventually dragged themselves back to their car and drove away into the night. The legal fallout over the next 8 months was an absolute, beautiful carnage for them. The justice system moves slowly, but it grinds incredibly fine. Because my mother had 0 prior criminal offenses, her expensive public defender managed to negotiate a plea deal before it went to a jury trial. She pleaded guilty to a lesser felony charge of access device fraud to avoid actual prison time. She was officially sentenced to 5 years of strict supervised probation, required to pay massive punitive fines to the state, and now has a permanent felony conviction on her record for the rest of her life. Because of the strict bylaws regarding felony convictions, the Homeowners Association, in their pristine, upscale retirement community, legally forced them to sell their house and move out. My sister's divorce proceedings were an absolute bloodbath, with the undeniable forensic evidence of her marital asset dissipation, combined with a police report detailing her family's direct involvement in criminal fraud to fund her legal defense. The family court judge absolutely destroyed her. She was awarded 0 alimony. My brother-in-law was granted full, exclusive ownership of the house, and my sister was legally saddled with the entirety of the massive debt she had fraudulently acquired during the marriage. With no money and ruined credit, she was forced to move into a cheap, cramped, terrible apartment with my disgraced parents. Sometimes, I sit in my large corner office late at night, looking out over the rows of massive freight trucks that belong entirely to me. I think back to that terrified 18-year-old kid who thought his life was completely over because his bank account balance was $14. They genuinely thought taking my money would break me, that I would just fold and quietly accept my place at the bottom of their hierarchy. But fire doesn't destroy iron. It tempers it. They handed me a lump of coal, and I spent 10 years crushing it into a diamond. I learned the hard way that blood does not make a family, and that blind entitlement is the absolute quickest path to self-destruction. The universe doesn't always balance the scales on its own, but sometimes, if you have the patience and spine to aggressively enforce your own boundaries, you get to sit back and watch terrible people build their own gallows and step right up to the noose. If you want to hear more stories about how to legally, systematically ruin entitled relatives while simultaneously managing a highly profitable supply chain logistics firm, make sure to hit that subscribe button. I might just start offering a weekly masterclass on emotional detachment and heavy freight shipping.